And option number 4 is a sort of rattle approach, so the rattle trial that was presented in Lugano recently, of 2 ABVDs, an interim PET, and either de-escalation or escalation, depending on the result. What would people generally go for? What would you do, Newcastle?
So with our stage 4, so we tend to stick with ABVD up to stage 3, and with stage 4, high risk stage 4, we have the conversation. So we chat with them about the risk benefits of escalated BCOP versus ABVD. For men, there's also obviously the fertility issue. So I think in my experience, I've had more women choosing ABVD and more men choosing escalated BCOP in terms of ability to store sperm before and go for treatment. But we would do the conversation, like I would be tempted with him with that bony disease to go escalated BCOP.
I think that'd be a very reasonable option. Yeah. Any other thoughts? I mean, I think we in Oxford tend to be ABVD lovers, so we would have probably gone the rattle approach with him. But I must say, I do sometimes feel uncomfortable doing that. In fact, I've got a patient at the moment who's had 2 ABVDs in primary progressive disease. She was a stage 4, but she was all super diaphragmatic and had no other high-risk features. So I still think I would have offered ABVD, but you do replay it in your mind, should we have gone for escalated BCOP, because they're the ones, it's the primary progressive ABVDs that I feel very uncomfortable about. If you use escalated BCOP, you very, very rarely, even more rarely than ABVD, see primary progression. So most of the UK, I think, still adopts ABVD, but I think using a risk stratified approach like that is a perfectly good option. Now this guy, actually it wasn't 2 years ago, it was about 4 years ago that this guy had his initial presentation. So we weren't really using a risk adaptive approach with him, but the current BCSH guidelines, what they're worth, and I think they're very sensible actually, do encourage this discussion with the patient. And one thing I think is worth emphasising with escalated BCOP is it does sterilise more people, there's no doubt, but it's not universally sterilising. So there is this belief that if you have escalated BCOP, you're infertile. If you look at the literature from the German Hodgkin study group, if you're 20 years old, there's about a 20% risk of infertility. And if you're 30 years old, there's about a 30 to 35% risk. So it sort of goes with your age. Of course, as you get older, the risk goes much higher because you're approaching menopause, at least in women. So you're not, you don't sterilise everybody, but clearly there's a much higher risk because the risk with ABVD is basically 0, and it's very, very kind of fertility. Okay, so he was offered ABVD all 6 cycles. This was before the days of interim PET scanning, so he didn't have an interim PET because there was just no evidence that it would change what we offered him. He tolerated it extremely well, which of course many people do with ABVD. That's why it's a regime that a lot of people still favour. The lump under his arm clinically regressed initially, but after 6 courses we were concerned that it was starting to come back. So it wasn't a huge surprise when we did the end of treatment PET, and you can see that this lump under the left arm here is pretty much the same size as it was, and he still has a lesion in his right eye bone. It's smaller, but it's definitely there. So really he has primary refractory disease progressing before the treatment's finished. His haemoglobin was 138, so that was okay. How would you assess his risk at relapse? And I'd be interested to hear what first-line salvage people would offer around the room and what your goal of salvage treatment is. So what would you say his risk was? Any thoughts?
He's got refractory disease, and so he's in a very high-risk group. So we would move straight to salvage here, and we tend to use DHAP, but we'd be happy using an IVU. And my goal would be to try and get him PET negative and then auto him.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we've got several patients like this at the moment who you just can't get the response with to get them to auto. We can't get them with 2 lines of salvage. So with those group, if we're getting response, we go to Allo.
Yeah. And would you biopsy? Would you re-biopsy it?
Probably. It's both in sites where he's had disease previously, so probably not.
Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, on the pro side, it's a lump under his arm, so it's quite easy to get to. But on the other side, you're right. It's exactly. report to biopsy probe the disease then, so I certainly don't think it'd be mandated. Any other first-line salvage regime that people would use?
Probably use ESHAT.
ESHAT, yeah.
I'm thinking about the mic biopsy again, just in that sometimes.
I think you're never wrong. Yeah.
Get rid of the question with regards to the something actually inside. The obviously are possible because they're, on their competencies at presentation or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Could have been a grey zone.
Biopsy everybody.
Yeah, I think if in doubt, biopsy is a really good principle, and it's hard to criticise anybody for biopsy, whereas you could potentially be criticised for not biopsy. I guess the one situation where I get really nervous when people haven't biopsied is when people go for allograft. And I think and it is possible to get to allograft with only having that initial diagnostic biopsy, and that does worry me. I think to offer something with such a high TRM, autographs I think a bit different, but to offer an allograft with a high TRM with no repeat biopsy I think is difficult. So if this guy goes for allo, I would say do biopsy.
My recent experience has been in Pakistan. We found quite a lot of TB in rebiopsies samples, which is always a good news.
Yes.
Because salvage options are limited, so when you find TB, you save a lot.
Yes. That's a very good point. And recently, I recently had 2 patients with newly diagnosed TB in clinic, both of whom I thought had lymphoma clinically. And this was a new diagnosis, so this was their first biopsy. But it's a lesson for me who doesn't see much TB that there really is a differential. So and as Wendy said, I think most people would say now the goal of treatment is to get PET negative. So if you look at sort of risk scores at relapse, I'm always a little bit dubious as to how useful these things are, because basically you treat them in fairly similar ways. But the German Hodgkin study group have the biggest database of patients, and they did this multivariate analysis, as you can do when you've got these big databases looking for risk. And these are the 3 factors that they found. So time to relapse, stage of relapse, and anemia. I think the one other sort of thing that's worth saying there is proper primary refractory disease where you progress on chemo like this man. I think people would also say is a very poor prognostic factor, and a number of other groups have found that. So I think that's his main risk, this guy. And the idea of getting PET negative really comes from data like this. So this is from the Memorial Sloan Kettering group, where patients were treated with salvage chemotherapy. They had a functional imaging scan, which nowadays would be FDG PET, but they did do some gallium studies in this scan, so that's why you see the FI negative, FI positive. And you can see that if people got functional imaging negative just before their autograft, the outcome was really good, so about an 80%, 75-80% cure rate essentially. Whereas if you didn't get PET negative with that treatment line, and went for the autograft, your chance of cure from the autograft was really quite low. It's not 0. You've got about a 30% chance of cure, and I think that's important, particularly when you think about auto versus allo. So there is a cure rate, and remembering, of course, that autografts have very low TRM. So I think there is debate in the UK about allo versus auto in this situation.
So was that affected by how many lines of salvage treatment you had?
So in that study, no. In that study, they just literally, anyone they've done autograft, they just did a scan. I will show you in a minute the data that they've shown lines of treatment, because that is a very important question.
PET negative in that context would be Deauville 3, would it? Or?
Yeah, so again, these studies were done before the Deauville criteria came. Most people now would say Deauville 3 is a negative scan. Pretty much whatever study's been done, the Deauville 3 seem to do as well, or as badly, but as well usually as the Deauville 1 and 2s. So for MDT purposes now, when I see a patient with MDT, I'll take a Deauville 1 to 3 straight to autograft, and they're the ones generally that do well. Yeah, no, thank you. We tend to use ICE. I mean, I really think it's, you cannot say what's the best salvage regime to use. I think ESHAT is absolutely fine. I think IVE, DHAP, fine. We're just used to using it. We're thinking of changing because it's an inpatient regime, and things like GDP are outpatient, so we're actually thinking of making that switch. IGEV, I think, is outpatient. But yeah, that's what we're used to using. He had 2 cycles. We did a PET scan, which is again where we arbitrarily do our PET scan at first-line salvage, but still, he's got that lump under the arm and the uptake in the iliac bone, so he's now refractory to ICE. So this is where you start, and it sounds like, Wendy, you're going through this with some patients. This is where I start to really worry. now that we're losing these guys. So if we were to take him straight to an autograft, the data would suggest that he's got a 75%, 75% chance of relapsing after the autograft, and then we're in really difficult territory. So how would you manage the patient next? How did you manage yours as you've got?
So we went second line salvage, so we dehacked IVE.
Yeah.
I think that we argue quite a bit about this patient. Sometimes we go brentuximab. Depends on the disease. There's a lot of disease volume. We're not getting great results with brentuximab, but they're doing better if we've only got a small amount of disease volume. I don't think, they've got two distinct areas there. I think that's probably a bit too much for radiotherapy, but I always try and make sure that I've looked at the radiotherapy options definitely.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and it's very easy for haematologists like me to forget the radiotherapy options. So yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. I think in this guy, you could just spot weld under the arm and in the eye echo, but it doesn't really make logical sense, does it? So I would certainly support the idea of some sort of second-line salvage. Anyone else, any options for what you would use as a second-line salvage? What would you use in your centre?
We use IVE.
You'd use IVE, yeah.
Or we have used gemcitabine with these
Yeah.
regimens. We have used GDP as well, but usually IVE.
Yeah. More and more centres now, and I've got a little bit of data on it, are using brentuximab, as you say, whereas I feel a little bit uncomfortable about using it. I have used it myself in second-line salvage, and there's not that much data supporting its use, and the data that's there isn't amazing. Can I just ask, what's the availability of brentuximab in Pakistan? Can you use it?
Everything is cost.
Yes.
So if patient can afford it, they can get things
Yeah.
from anywhere in the world. But if they can't afford it, so we use like my recent experience has been mostly pediatric. So gemcitabine was gemcitabine and Reno was what we used.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That's interesting. Whereabouts in Pakistan do you work?
I'm in Peshawar right now.
Okay. Cool, here. So these were the options, and I know we've discussed it already, but I think proceeding with autograft is an option, but the chances of success are fairly low. Many people, I think, in the UK now would plan for an allogeneic stem cell transplant. So I think that is fairly controversial. Switch to second-line salvage to get a better remission is probably the most commonly used approach now. And I put this up to remind myself to advertise a clinical trial that we're planning. Of course, it's always good to put people in a clinical trial. In the UK, there isn't one available at this particular point, but there hopefully will be, so I'll come on to that. Now, so what is the data of allogeneic stem cell transplant in second remission? And in the UK, we're fairly unique around the world for thinking about allografts in this situation. I think most of us are fairly comfortable doing it, but if you talk to our US colleagues, they think we're mad. They're trying to use less and less allogeneic transplant, whereas we're using it, we're adding more and more. And the data we've got is this, which is retrospective data. There is a prospective trial that's looking at allogeneic stem cell transplant in those who failed first-line salvage, so just this setting. It's finished recruitment in the UK, and the data is almost ready to be looked at and published. So we should be hearing that data fairly soon. It's a phase 2, there's no randomisation in it, but that'll give us much more sort of robust data looking at this approach. But this was 61 patients, all who had relapsed Hodgkin's. About half of them became PET negative and went straight to autograft, and had a fantastic progression-free survival. 85.7. It does beg the question whether you need to autograft everybody in this setting, which is an extremely controversial thing to say. But I'm actually more and more of the opinion that we should be picking out people with very low risk relapse and not potentially autografting them. But anyway, don't take that away and put that into practice. But I think we should be looking at that actually in the context of studies. And I'm willing to elaborate on that if you want to later. In this group, 41% went to an allogeneic stem cell transplant. All of them were PET positive after their first line of salvage. And again, an excellent 3-year progression-free survival of 68%, overall survival of 88%. So this is very impressive data, albeit fairly small numbers. A retrospective single institution look back, and we'll get more data on and what that looks like when the multi-centre trial reports. So this has really been the basis of a lot of the UK practice. In terms of switching to alternative salvage and trying to get PET negative for an autograft, that's really based on this data here, which is again from Memorial Sloan Kettering. It was their follow-on publication, if you like, from the one I showed earlier. And this is their, or this was their strategy of relapse. It's actually changed now, they've incorporated brentuximab. But with a relapsed Hodgkin's patient, they would give ice, not the sort of ice that we tend to give. They risk stratify their ice. So if you're high risk relapse, they give something called augmented ice, which is sort of supercharged ice. Low risk, they would give the more standard ice that perhaps we're used to giving. PET scan after 2 courses, negative straight to high dose therapy, positive, they switch to this gemcitabine-based regime, and then would do another PET, but take everyone to autografts. And these were their outcomes here. So you can see that those top 2 lines are all the people that became PET negative, whether it took 1 or 2 lines of salvage to get there. This bottom line are people who stayed PET positive after second-line treatment. So the take-home message of this is it didn't matter how you became PET negative, whether you needed 1 or 2 lines. If you became PET negative, you did very well. And that's really the basis of this idea of switching to second-line salvage and still aiming for an autograft if you get PET negative. And I think most people are doing that now. The key question is, what do we use here? I think is a perfectly reasonable thing to give. We tend to use GemP because that's got gemcitabine in, and gemcitabine was here. And as I say, more and more people are using brentuximab because it does, to the letter of the license, it does fit, because the license is failed 2 or more lines of chemotherapy and not suitable for a stem cell transplant. It doesn't say not fit, it says not suitable for a stem cell transplant, and you can easily argue that if you're PET positive, you're not suitable for a stem cell transplant. You might become suitable if you get PET negative, but you're not suitable at that time. And so more and more people have been putting brentuximab in there, even though there's not that much data to support it, but there is some. Now, in terms of clinical trials, this is I'm afraid this is a big really for those of us who practice in the UK. We're hoping that this study will be up and running in about 9 months' time. I say we're hoping. We've got funding for free drug and a grant to fund the translational research. We're just waiting now to check we've got the trial costs covered by CR UK, and we should be hearing in about 2 months' time. But what this trial is doing, the ANIMATE study, there's actually a story around the name. We first called it the Nimrod study, and I actually really like that name because Nimrod means mighty hunter. But it also means, in the States, it means an idiot. And BMS, when we talked about laughing at us when we were using the name Nimrod, saying, well, what's wrong? So they told us, so we thought we better change it. So ANIMATE is its name now. So we basically want to get everybody who has relapsed Hodgkin's, and we want to enrol them during their first-line salvage. So at any point during their first 2 cycles of chemo, we'd like to enrol them. Then they have their PET scan done under trial conditions, and that's why it's so important to enrol them early on, because that first PET scan is key. If it's negative, then they just go standard of care, which we assume in pretty much every centre will be an autograft, although we're not going to specify that, but I'm sure. If they're PET positive, those are the ones that we're going to add the PD-1 inhibitor, nivolumab, to. So we're really looking at how good nivolumab is as a bridge to first stem cell transplant. So they get 4 cycles, then another PET. If they're negative, they'll go presumably for an autograft, but we're not going to specify what they go for, but they come off trial. If not, and there's no frank progressive disease, they get another 4 courses, another PET, and whatever the PET shows, then they're off trial. The interesting thing here will be, what do you do if they've got sort of, still PET positive, but they've had some sort of response? Do you autograft them? Do you allograft them? But some people feel quite nervous about allografting people who've had a PD-1 inhibitor because you might be sort of stimulating their immune system and make graft versus host disease worse. So there's going to be all sorts of fun calls that I'm sure I'm going to get when this trial is running. I've got some thoughts which I can tell you about another time. But so we're really wanting to assess how good is nivolumab as a bridge to stem cell transplant. And these are our endpoints. The reason for doing this, I just want to see if I've got it. No, I don't have it. The reason for doing this is that brentuximab, as I say, it has a role in second-line salvage, but what you often see with brentuximab, if you have a CR, and it's about a 30% CR rate in pretty much whatever context you use brentuximab, then that CR tends to be quite stable, and so you can take people to a stem cell transplant. But my experience and what the literature seems to suggest now is if you have a PR, that remission really is very short. So quite often we'll do a PET scan after 3 and you'll see a decent reduction but PET avidity still. You then get the stem cell transplant ready and you do another PET after 5, just about to autograft or allograft them, and lo and behold it's progressing again. And it's a very consistent pattern. Have you seen that as well? And what the literature suggests is that in that, if you get them in the CR, you can transplant them, whereas if you get them in the PR, it's very unusual to get them to a transplant. So the advantage of nivolumab is, although it has a lower CR rate, it only has about a 15-16% complete remission rate in the trials, although why that is an interesting story. Those remissions are very stable. So even if you get a partial remission, we hope and we expect that will give a better platform to go to a stem cell transplant. What stem cell transplant will be more of a controversy. So that's the clinical trial we're hoping to get running. So what do we do with our patients? Well, we did R about brentuximab or gemcitabine-based approach, but we decided to go with GNP. Clinically, his lump got no better, so we felt he had refractory disease. We wanted to prove it, and there's his PET scan again, the big red lump under the left arm. So we were really struggling, and he also, I should say, had the iliac uptake as well. So we were really struggling to know what to do. We were hoping to get into an autograft, but we were thinking now that this is looking more chemo-refractory. So we had a long discussion with him about heading for an allogeneic stem cell transplant. The problem is he had no sibling match. We did an HLA search, and we had no fully matched donors. I think the best that we had for him was a 2-antigen mismatch, which when you get to that sort of level is a pretty risky transplant. This was just, I guess, before the days where haploidentical transplants were more accepted in Hodgkin's. I think we would probably think about that now. He also was extremely unkeen to go to allograft, despite quite a lot of encouragement. And clinically, we were worried. I mean, his bronchiectasis was a concern to us, so we were really struggling with to know what to do with this guy. What would you do? I'm glad there's silence. There's no easy answer, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Yes, and that's actually what we did. Yeah. Any other thoughts? I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean,
some patients do get radiotherapy quicker.
Yes, and again, if it was early stage, I think absolutely. Some people never relapse, even with very difficult disease, if it's encompassable in the field. With him, he still did have that iliac uptake, so we could have done it as a palliative good remission. But I think we would all be pretty convinced it would come back again.
Do you try and get him a PD-1?
Yeah, so nowadays I think that's a very realistic option. The problem with PD-1s, there are some people from BMS here, but I can't get a PD-1 on compassionate use. I've tried, and I can't do it. So the only way at the moment we could get it is if the patient paid for it, which I assume they could do. I'm looking in the direction of my BMS colleagues, because it is licensed for melanoma, so you can buy it and then use it in an unlicensed way under the governance of your trust. But it's very expensive, or a trial, and realistically it's trials. There is actually, and this is again another shameless advert, there is a PD-L1 inhibitor trial that's about to open in the UK for this sort of patient, so relapse refractory, even post-allo they're taking people, which is rather brave. And that's a drug called Aethera, which is Pfizer's PD-L1 inhibitor, and that's opening in a few weeks in the UK.
And for that one, you don't have to have got to auto.
You don't, no. It's actually a phase 1-2. So the phase 1 isn't starting at tiny doses, they're looking at different dosing schedules, but that's very lax eligibility, if you like. As long as you've got relapsed refractory Hodgkin's and your renal function okay, etc., then you can go in. So yeah, it's not the very strict post-auto eligibility. I know it's opening in Leeds, which is probably your closest centre. So we tried brentuximab. I mean, this will be an extremely familiar slide to you, I know. I'd really put it up for 2 points, and that is to say that I'm quite distrustful of waterfall plots now. I mean, it is an amazing waterfall plot, but I've been involved in a few trials now that have reasonable waterfall plots, but the drug really is not very good, and they hide things, waterfall plots. So in these other drugs I've been involved with, you can have a mixed response, so where the bulk of your tumour goes down, but your lymphoma in the neck goes up, your overall volume has reduced, so it's going below the line, but you've got progressive disease. You know, and so there are these caveats with waterfall plots. Much more relevant is your PFS and duration of remission. And as I've mentioned before, your PFS of brentuximab is not that good, it's about 6 months, because of the PRs. The CRs do really well, so if you get into a CR, you can do very well on brentuximab, but partial remissions don't do very well. However, and this was the rationale I think that a lot of people use it as second-line salvage, in this paper here, if you look at the PFS from brentuximab, it is on average longer in this study than the PFS from the prior line of treatment, which was often multi-agent chemo. So it's sort of, you know, that led some of us to think, well, if we've given ICE and it hasn't worked, we should probably use brentuximab because the PFS of that is better than multi-agent chemo beforehand. That's the sort of logic that led a lot of us to use brentuximab. And you know, it is generally well tolerated, and I'm sure we're all aware of the side effects. It's the two ends, it's neuropathy and neutropenia are the two issues, obviously neuropathy being the most concerning. And this, I mentioned that there's not much data using it pre-autograft. This was published recently in The Oncologist, which is one of the biggest series. It's only 30 patients of relapsed refractory Hodgkin's, all prior to auto. So that's the key here. Median prior number of lines was 3. And they gave a median of 4 cycles. Now, when brentuximab first came out, there was this big issue of how many cycles do you use? Because, of course, they use 16 or up to 16 post-autograft. I don't know anybody who would use that prior to a stem cell transplant. As we mentioned already, if you get a partial remission, that's not stable, so you really want to transplant. If you're going to do it, you want to transplant as soon as you can. And that's reflected really by this study here, that there's a median of 4. And that's what I do. I give 3, I do a PET. If the PET's a CR, you can relax a little bit. If the PET's a PR, you need to transplant as soon as you can. And it's usually an allograft we're heading for at that point. So they showed a fairly typical CR rate of 30%, and say this is pretty stable in whatever study you look at. The overall response rate varies a little bit between trials, but it was 40% here. There's small numbers, obviously. And of the 12 who had a CR, 9 went to an autograft. So as I say, if you get a CR, it is a useful agent to bridge. But if you don't, it's very difficult. And hardly anyone who had a PR went on to have a stem cell transplant from this group. So we talked a lot to this guy at this point, so we did go for brentuximab, and he didn't get a CR, but he had a PR, so you can see that finally that lump under the left arm is shrinking, although it's still there, it's still quite avid. And again, we had a long discussion about where we could go. He was very keen on still going for an autograft, with the caveat that you know, there's quite a high likelihood that he would relapse after. We didn't feel that pressing on with more and more cycles of brentuximab would get him into a CR for the reasons that I've already talked about. And actually, you know, I think 30% cure rate is not insubstantial. And I have this discussion a lot now with patients who are PET positive after salvage, the benefits of allo, the benefits of auto. And I find actually people often opt, you know, there's a fairly balanced mix of what people want. The way I explain it is, I say, look, if you go for an autograft, you've got a 1 to 2% transplant-related mortality, you've got about a 30% chance of long-term remission, whereas if you go for an allograft, you've got about a 10 to 15% mortality rate with around a 50 to 60% cure rate. What do you want to do? And of course, then everyone says, well, can I have an auto, and if I relapse after that, go for the allo? Which, of course, you can. What we don't know is, well, what we think is that your outcome from the allo is probably a little less good if you've had an autograft, because you've had more toxicity to the body, your tumour may be more chemo-resistant when it comes back, you can't guarantee to get people in remission for the allo. So there are caveats around that approach, but that's probably our commonest approach still with PET-positive patients. I appreciate that not every centre does that, and there are many centres in the UK that would very strongly push pharma in that situation. So he had a B autograft, fairly uncomplicated, much to our relief, with his history of bronchiectasis, etc. He grafted pretty quickly, and he had a PET scan 3 months after his stem cell reinfusion, which was in a CR, which was nice, and we gave radiotherapies to the left axilla. That was our most high-risk spot. And currently, he's in an ongoing CR. I'm still expecting him to relapse, I have to say, but he hasn't so far. So, I mean, watch this space. It's relatively late now for him to relapse, because we transplanted him about 2 years ago. And if you look at the relapse post-auto curves, they're nearly all within 2 years. So who knows? He might be in that 30%. I guess one other thing I just wanted to mention is, what about the Aethera trial? I don't know if you're familiar with the Aethera trial, but the Aethera trial was looking at giving brentuximab vedotin after an autograft in people who have high-risk relapses. So this patient would be a sort of classic Aethera trial candidate. And this was the study. So it was a randomized phase 3 study. I heard from Craig Moscovitz yesterday, this is the only study in Hodgkin's that's ever used placebo. And I thought that was quite interesting, and it's certainly the biggest relapsed Hodgkin's study that's ever been performed. What they did is they defined high risk clinically, and this really is the Achilles heel of this trial, because they didn't define it according to PET pre-auto, which is the real problem with it, but they defined it clinically. So these were their 3 criteria, and all you need is one of these to be defined as a high risk relapse. So if you're refractory to frontline treatment, relapsed within 12 months, or relapsed after 12 months but had extranodal disease, say a lump in the lung or in the bone or something, then you were high risk. You had whatever salvage your institution gave, you were restaged, and as long as you didn't have progressive disease, you then went through the autograft and were randomized afterwards to brentuximab vedotin up to 16 courses versus placebo infusions, and it was a blinded trial. So from a sort of trial governance point of view, it was a very good study. I mentioned the PETs already. PETs were not mandated. There was various reasons for that. Obviously, when you design a trial, you don't always have the information that we now have 5 years later, and PETs weren't routine standard of care pre-auto, and there were some countries they wanted to run this in, such as Germany, who actually find reimbursement for PETs quite difficult, so they didn't feel they would be able to open a PET-directed study in those countries. But it is a real shame that it didn't routinely involve PET, because that, in terms of getting this licensed, I think that may be a stumbling block. I won't go into the baseline characteristics, but they're very standard really for relapsed Hodgkin's and a reasonably high-risk group. In terms of number of cycles, they actually got up to 15 cycles as a median number of cycles. So most patients got a lot of cycles of brentuximab. And these are the PFS results here. So at 24 months, for the brentuximab group, it was 65%, and for the placebo group, 45%. So you're looking at a 20% gain in PFS at 24 months with a very significant hazard ratio and p-value. So it was a positive study in that respect. And here's the curve. When I first saw the curve, this is the updated curves. When a lot of us first saw the curves, we wondered if they were just going to be pushing the relapses on. I have to say, I don't think that's the case now. You know, they really do seem flat, these curves now. So I think you are genuinely curing about 15 to 20% more people. Of course, there's still the issue that you're treating this number of people, nearly 50% of people who don't need it, for the benefits of 20%. I mean, this is always the issue with trials. But when you've got a very expensive drug like this, can you really justify that health economically? Now, thankfully, that's not up to me to determine, but that's really going to drive, I think, whether we're going to be able to use this in the UK. This is licensed in the States. It's now regarded as standard of care for high-risk relapsed Hodgkin's in the US. It's licensed in certain other countries. I was in Israel quite recently. It's licensed there. It's not licensed yet in Europe, but it's going through the process. It's with the EMEA at the moment. So watch this space. The other thing I want to point out for you, I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to survival curves, and I think this is a very interesting survival curve, in that if you look here, all your gain is in the first few months. So after about this point here, which is 6 months, the curves are pretty much parallel. So the split happens very early. So lots of us believe, and I would certainly subscribe to this, that what brentuximab is probably doing is helping to cure people who have disease at the time of transplant. And you're helping prevent those very early relapses. And that begs the question, do you really need 16 cycles? I mean, I really don't think you do. Personally, if I am allowed to do this, I think I would use brentuximab after an autograft if it's funded in certain situations, not in everybody who would be eligible for Aethera. I would only use 8 cycles. I just don't think I could justify going up to 16. There were 2 deaths on the brentuximab arm, probably related to the study drug, 1 pancreatitis and 1 pneumonitis. So it's not without its morbidity. Having said that, actually it was tolerated quite well by most patients. Now these are subgroup analyses, which you've obviously got to be a bit careful interpreting in a trial, but the one I want to point out to you is this one here. So in people who had a PET, as I said, this wasn't mandated by the trial, but if people had it, then they wanted that information. These weren't centrally reviewed, this is just what the centre said. But you can see that if you had PET negativity pre-autograft, the lines are much, much closer together. suggesting that, and I've not seen the positive PET data. I don't think they presented that, I don't know why, but I can't find a curve of people who have had a positive PET pre-auto. But certainly those who have a negative PET seem to do less well. They make a lot of the fact that if you had a negative PET but 2 or more of those clinical risk factors, you might benefit, but the curves are still a lot closer together. So I think if you have a negative PET pre-auto, I probably wouldn't be offering consolidation or maintenance brentuximab after. I just don't think it's that justified. These curves here that have really wide separations, this is your partial response before an autograft, but that's based on CT, that's not PET, and here's your stable disease. So again, I think it just reflects the fact that if you have disease on a scan pre-auto, those are the ones who would probably benefit most from using brentuximab.
How many women had brentuximab before?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in this trial, hardly any.
Okay.
That is going to be an issue because, of course, you know, we in the UK we've run the Echelon 1 trial where people were getting brentuximab ABVD. What happens if they relapse? It's hard. I think if they don't have neuropathy and if they had a decent remission after their brentuximab ABVD, I think I would want to treat them as any other patient. And if we had brentuximab to offer and they were a high-risk relapse, PET positive disease pre-auto, I would be quite keen to offer it again. What I'm not sure about, and I've not heard anyone really say one or the other, is even if you don't have clinical neuropathy, are you much more likely to get neuropathy with more brentuximab due to subclinical sort of priming of neuropathy? I don't know.
And if they've been refractory to brentuximab?
If they're refractory to brentuximab, absolutely not. No, I don't think there's any point. And that was the safety information. As I say, there were 2 deaths, but basically it was quite well tolerated. There was a lot of peripheral neuropathy, but most of it grade 1 and 2. 22 cases were grade 3. Now, grade 3 basically means you're almost in a wheelchair. It's bad, grade 3. Grade 4 is life-threatening, so you know, grade 4 is really a catastrophe. There were no grade 4s, but there were 22 grade 3s, most of whom you can see had at least some sort of resolution at the end. But it's very nasty grade 3. I've never wish that on anybody. So I guess these are the sort of key learning points I wanted to get from this case. Has anyone got anything else they want to raise about relapsed Hodgkin's? Any difficult cases you want to share? As I say, I do have another case which we could run through, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on relapsed Hodgkin's. Yeah.
I'd like to mention the fact that the Rattle study seems to tell us that escalated BCOP is more dangerous, so to say, than normal BCOP. And you're still, indicating that the discussion between ABVD and escalated BCOP is the issue. Can you comment on that?
So I think it is an issue. Yeah, I can comment on that. So the Germans have looked at escalated BCOP versus BCOP 14, which was the option.
Yeah.
In the Rattle. In the Rattle, we use BCOP 14 because it's much easier to give in an outpatient. That's why we used it. So escalated BCOP, sure, it is more intensive. There's more episodes of febrile neutropenia. It is more risky in that respect. There are more AEs, but it is more effective than BCOP 14. So that's why the Germans haven't switched to BCOP 14 in advanced stage disease, because you do get less good disease control. Now in the Rattle, as I say, centres could opt for BCOP 14 or escalated BCOP. They did look at the difference to see if one seemed to be better than the other. That wasn't found, but of course it's relatively small numbers of people who were PET positive and went to BCOP, and it wasn't at all powered to find a difference between escalated BCOP and BCOP 14. We still, now off trial, we still use BCOP 14 if patients are PET positive because it is a bit easier to use and because the Rattle didn't show a difference. But I think if you're going for BCOP up front for disease control, you've still really got to go for escalated BCOP because, as I say, the data of BCOP 14 is just a bit less good.
In your case, you gave radiotherapy to the axilla,
Yeah.
not to the bone.
Yeah.
For our patients, the sites, so we're trying not to extrapolate our Hodgkin from our DLB. So for our DLB patients, we would give 3 or less bone sites. We would give for Hodgkin's, we are trying to trust the PET. But if we were going to give any radiotherapy, we would have probably given it to bone.
To the extraluminal site, yeah.
Do you give bone consolidation radiotherapy if PET negative, or do you not tend to worry?
I think giving us, so I guess the first thing to say is we try to give radiotherapy at relapse. because we're worried at relapse, so we try to use any treatment modality that's sensible. With this guy, his bony disease was more responsive than the nodal disease. So by the time of autograft, I showed you that his nodal disease had responded. He was actually now in a CR on the bone, which is why we went for radiation to the axilla. Whether we were right to do that, I don't know. Certainly, if he still did have a lump in the bone, we would have done both.
So one of the pediatric approaches is that you radiate there's bone involvement even at presentation.
Yeah.
So, most of the PET positive sites would be radiated after the hemograft.
Yeah. Do you follow a Euronet approach? Yeah. So, I mean, Euronet is, I've just come back from Kiel, which was the Euronet meeting. So I'm not a paediatrician, but I feel I know a little bit more about paediatric approaches now.
I'm not a paediatrician, but I'm forced to.
You're forced into it, yeah. And certainly the Euronet approach from previous trials, they use a lot of radiotherapy, and I think that as clinicians treating adult Hodgkin's, it makes our eyes water really, the amount of radiotherapy that was used. Now, and yes, so they would irradiate any site of original PET positivity, so children were getting huge fields. That is changing, so in their current trial, in C2, I mean C1, the radiotherapy went down, so it was only about 20% of patients being irradiated. In C2, which is only just opened, the protocol would mean even fewer than that now would get irradiated because they're using PET much more. But, yeah.
A lot of the bone radiation was basically bone marrow involvement rather than bone initially, but
Yes.
it's now that if it's truly bone involvement, you irradiate but not more.
Yeah. Okay, just keeping on time. Okay, we're going to start just thinking about the next case. So the other group of patients that I find difficult are elderly Hodgkin's. And it's always a surprisingly high burden of disease, I think. I mean, it's not common, our clinics aren't overwhelmed with Hodgkin's in the elderly, but, there is a clear second relative peak of incidence, even though the absolute numbers of elderly Hodgkin's is lower than the younger age. And I'm sure that you'd agree that these patients do relatively badly. I really struggle with elderly Hodgkin's. We have a number of, we recently went back and audited our 15-year data of Hodgkin's, and the single biggest prognostic factor was age, and it was more than 50 in our cohort did very badly. So I think they are an unmet need, and that's reflected by data here. These bottom two curves, the red curve here is more than 45 years of age, stage 1 and 2. This is more than 45 years of age, stage 2B, 4. Clearly showing that elderly people do a lot worse whether you're early or late stage disease. So it's a difficult group. Why is it a difficult group? Well, I don't think we've got a very reliable answer to that. Obviously comorbidities comes into it, but even if you have fitter older people, the relapse rates are clearly higher. So it may well be that the biology is slightly different. There's a higher incidence of mixed cellularity disease. There's a higher incidence of intradiaphragmatic disease as well. And it's relatively common for somebody to come with a groin node that's been biopsied and you do a PET and it's all intradiaphragmatic. That's very unusual in a younger person, but relatively more common in older people. So it's intriguing, I think, this difference biologically as people get older. And obviously there's issues giving chemotherapy. It is more toxic generally in the elderly. They clear it less, they have more comorbidities, etc. So this is a case study of a 74-year-old man who presented, I guess, with fatigue, so fairly generalised sort of symptoms, and a 2-month history of a right neck lump that precipitated the trip to the GP. No B symptoms, and reasonably fit when we saw him. Performance status was 1. He had hypertension, was on amlodipine, and had bilateral hip replacements for osteoarthritis. There's also some evidence of cerebrovascular disease. But he was actually, pretty fit, living alone, managing all of his activities of daily living. So, this is a fairly typical older patient we see in Oxford who, are still out there doing the allotments and when we did his staging scan, this was the disease. Now, this could have been from somebody a lot younger. It's all up actually above the diaphragm in this guy, but I'd certainly say he's early stage unfavourable. So he's got mediastinal disease, bilateral neck, and quite high neck there as well. So, this I think would be clearly early stage unfavourable. His haemoglobin was fine, his albumin was fine, ESR slightly raised even with taking his age into account, and of course he's male. So he's got some of the IPSS scores that would predict high risk disease. But he's by no means an IPSS5, I think. This was his nodal biopsy. Actually, it wasn't his nodal biopsy. This is from the internet. But it just shows you lovely weak Sternberg cells here.
Which are very rare to find them.
And a typical sort of microenvironment suggestive of classical Hodgkin's, and that's what he had. And actually it was nodular sclerosis, having said that the elderly and likes a mix of that. So how would you treat this patient? So he's 74, I say with relatively few comorbidities. He's not a smoker. There's no history of chest disease. Would you give ABVD? Would you give VEP-MB, Clavit, CHOP, AVD, PVAG? We won't do votes or anything, but how would people approach this case?
You'd probably give VEP-MB.
Yeah, you're from Newcastle. Yeah.
But would consider ABVD.
Yeah. What would, I'm interested because I think it's very difficult, but what would make you choose one?
We tend to not give any bleo once patients are over 65, and in the early 60s we've had quite a lot of bleotoxin, that group 60 to 65. Would prefer, if they are fit enough, we find that the dacarbazine is what's difficult for them to manage, so late 60s we might start to get a bit more concerned. Our patients tolerate VEP-MB very well, but we don't get the long-term benefits that we would with ABD. So I think if he sounds quite a fit 74, so I'm probably more tempted for the ABD, but and Clavit we just get rubbish results. We sort of do that to treat ourselves.
How about what would you use in Pakistan?
ABD would be a preferred option. We don't want to do the risk of bleomycin.
Yeah.
But I mean, if he's otherwise very fit and well, and the chest is pristine, and we have had very and a normal pulmonary function test, then giving 2 cycles of ABVD and then de-escalating ABD after that, no matter what the PET scan shows. We wouldn't do a PET scan in this age.
That's interesting. I mean, I think if you look at each option, different countries tend to go for different options, which tells you there's no good evidence between them. I mean, ABVD is a bit controversial. VEP-MB, I think Italy use it quite a lot. We use it quite a lot. CHOP is very much a Nordic approach. They publish limited data, but it does look quite effective, and obviously for lymphoma doctors like us, it's a walk in the park. The Germans often use ABD or PVAG. So it's very sort of country-based as to what you get, which really suggests that there's no good evidence as to which one. I've just realised the time. So let me just basically come to the bottom line of what really I was going to say. When I was preparing this talk, I mean, we would use AVD. That's what we tend to use, unless, as Wendy said, they're in a much more sort of frail or anthracycline unfit group. Then we may use some sort of alkylating-based regime. We tend, I have to say, to use Clavit, but I'm not particularly defending it. I find it quite hard to give. There is actually some evidence out there for still using bleomycin in the elderly, but with the major caveat that I wouldn't go beyond 2 cycles. So actually you're suggesting giving 2 and de-escalating, a bit like the rattle, but not necessarily using the PET. I think is reasonable. And actually this is the German Hodgkin study group who went back through their trials looking at ABVD and ABD. And in the patients who only received 2 courses of ABVD, and that's 137 patients, so quite a lot, patients over 60, they saw extremely little bleomycin lung toxicity. Whereas as soon as they went over that and got 4 ABVDs, it was up to the 10% mark with some fatalities. So personally, I wouldn't use bleomycin in this age group. I'm still nervous about it, but I wouldn't criticise somebody who gave up to 2 courses. And the only other point I just wanted to mention was that there is some data that dropping the bleomycin does reduce the effectiveness a bit of ABVD. What we should routinely be doing in younger patients, dropping the bleo from the first course. The Germans did this wonderful trial where they sequentially dropped drugs from ABVD, so they dropped the bleo, they dropped the dacarbazine, they dropped 2 drugs just to see what happened really. I mean, it's a great trial. And basically it showed bleomycin was the less important drug of them, but even dropping the bleo gave you some reduction in your freedom from treatment failure. So the ABVD, and this is in young patients as well, went from 93 to 89%, but there were high numbers of patients, so that was a statistically significant difference. So it is an effective regime. But it's, in younger people, I would still start with ABVD and aim to drop the bleo after 2 cycles with negative interim pair. I think for the sake of time, we'd better stop there, but I'll hang around a bit, so I'd be delighted to discuss if you have anything you wanted to mention. And thank you very much for coming.